Hello and welcome to Cheetah TV. My name's Brian Badger from the Cheetah Conservation Fund. Now, we've put together a series called Conservation Conversations, and it's inviting guests along that in some way took part in the Global Cheetah Summit. Now, that was held in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in January 2024, and it highlights the diversity of conservation, all of the components that go together to not only save a species, but to save ecosystems. And today, our very special guest is Professor Amy Dickman. And earlier on, I got to talk to her and go over some of the key aspects of the Global Cheetah Summit. So without further ado, let's go and join Amy. So we're joined by Professor Amy Dickman, who's Professor of Wildlife Conservation and Director of Wild Crew at the University of Oxford. So very warm welcome to you, Amy.
Hi there, Brian. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and thanks very, very much for joining us. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do with Wild Crew and some of the other projects that you're involved with?
Yeah, thanks. So I've got two main hats, really. So I'm the director of the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford. And that's a group of about 60 researchers who work all over the world on pressing issues about conservation. So all sorts of different species. We've got a particular focus on large carnivores historically. And we look at all kinds of aspects from understanding human wildlife conflict to disease risks, lots of different things so that we can provide the evidence base to inform really effective conservation actions. And we go beyond the research into training and implementation as well, and then using research to actually examine how well that implementation goes so that we can make the next set of innovations and interventions hopefully more effective. And as part of that, I run a project called, or jointly run a project called Lion Landscapes with Elaine Cotterill, who's fantastic. So we work in 4 different landscapes in southern and East Africa, in Kenya, in Zambia, and in Tanzania. And we're working there to understand and reduce human wildlife conflict. So very similar to the kinds of work that CCF does.
So you mentioned CCF, and I know that you go back quite a long way with CCF and Dr. Laurie Marker, obviously. Can you tell us a little bit about your history with CCF, how that all started?
Yeah, definitely. So I've always been passionate about working with big cats. I've always wanted to do that. And it was one of those jobs that people said, well, you can't do it because there's no jobs in that. And I kept looking around and thinking, there must be some jobs in it. And I wrote to everyone in the cat specialist group. This shows how old I was because I sent physical letters to everyone in the cat specialist group. I remember Laurie was one of the very, very few who wrote back, and she said, there is potential here and, keep going. And I thought that was amazing that she'd taken the time. And then when I joined Wild Crew at that point as a very junior sort of intern, I joined them in 1997 and was determined to study big cats, but kept on being pushed onto all sorts of other different projects, water voles and water shrews and sometimes badgers. Nothing wrong with any of those species, but I wanted to work on big cats. And then I was about to leave actually and go to Cambridge, which no one at Oxford liked to leave for Cambridge. And and then suddenly Laurie joined Wild Crew, and so they asked me if I wanted to go out and work with her, sort of helping her as she was doing her PhD on understanding human cheetah conflict and writing that up. So I went out there. It was meant to be for 6 months, and I stayed there for 6 years. So it was fantastic.
There's a lesson to be learned there, because I often get asked when I'm talking to people like all around the world that are trying to kind of fulfill their dreams and reach their ideal targets and stuff like that. And it's a conservation is a very windy road. You kind of have to do some stuff that maybe not the top of your pick list, but to get to where you want to be. And that's a prime example. So in January of 2024, we had the Global Cheetah Summit in Addis Ababa, and you were instrumental in that summit. Why do you feel it was important to have that first ever Global Cheetah Summit?
I think it was really important, and it's fantastic, and huge credit particularly to the CCF team and all the partners from Ethiopia and beyond who enabled that. So it was great to have this really global perspective of cheetah conservation. So not just looking Often, at a national perspective, you tend to have cheetah meetings and workshops and action plans, or even a regional perspective. This was the first one that really took that global approach to it and brought together all these different stakeholders from Asia, from Africa, and thinking about what are the commonalities here? How do we build a real foundation going forward for cheetah conservation? Those foundations obviously exist in lots of places, but how do we synergize and bring together all the passion and the excitement that was in that room, all the knowledge and the incredible commitment to cheetah conservation, to think about what can we learn from each other and how we can help support each other to actually scale up those efforts for cheetah conservation so that we can do more for the kind of resources that we have.
Yeah, again, as you know, I was at the summit, and I was amazed about the diversity, and it brought all that diversity together, with a focus. Can you think of any highlights of the summit, and do you feel that, like, if not all, then a lot of the aims were met?
Yeah, I mean, I thought beforehand I just wasn't quite sure how much we were likely to get out of it in reality, because often you go to these summits and you find that, or these kinds of meetings, and you can find sometimes that it's not necessarily the sort of the commitment and the passion to actually make something happen. And for me, what stood out, the technical sessions were really interesting. It was fantastic to get the insights, you say, from that huge diversity of people. I thought it was very, it had a lot of different representations from different countries and stuff. So that was really great to see and to hear from those people. But I thought what really stood out for me was this really strong underlying commitment from everyone there to change those words into action, to think about how we move forward. Um, so you don't just end up with a cheetah sort of declaration and you all move away, but you've formed better relationships, you've shared ideas, and you take that commitment forward so that we can truly improve things on the ground.
Yeah, as to say, I was in awe with some of the presentations, and like you, it was not exactly skeptical, but a lot of the conferences that you go to are just networking, but this took networking to a whole different level. I thought, and it opened a lot of people's eyes. And I know one of the focuses, and the aims of the Global Cheetah Summit was the declaration. Is putting the declaration together. Can you explain what that declaration consists of, and how we compile, or how you compiled it?
Well, yeah, I mean, all of us worked together on looking at how could we, again, make this something slightly different from what has gone before. So one of the things that we really realized was that all too often you have conservationists talking to conservationists. So you end up with quite a specific and quite a technical plan, basically saying, in order to resolve or improve cheetah conservation, we need to do this about human wildlife conflict. We need to understand this about, I don't know, spatial ecology or whatever. But the problem is we tend to be talking to ourselves often, and we're doing a very poor job in general at expanding this beyond conservationists and not thinking about why would business people think about this? Why would healthcare professionals care about conservation? And so one of the key aspects that came out through the declaration was the need to expand these conversations beyond conservationists and into those other spheres. And we thought maybe the next step would be convening a meeting, or one of the next steps would be convening a meeting where we get those people up onto the panels and the conservationists do more listening rather than talking for once, so that we think about how conservation matters to those other people, to the vast majority of people who are not conservationists. So that was one really important aspect that came out of it. And so we wanted to identify stakeholder groups and contacts for that. And then think about really how do we move this from quite a fluffy desire to say we just want cheetahs because cheetahs are pretty. We all think that cheetahs are fantastically pretty and incredible animals, but that's never going to be enough for a business case for conservation. So as part of that beyond conservationist topic, we need to think about how do we get business people onto the case? How do we make an actual strategic business case that speaks to priorities of people and therefore of politicians? So there's a big element about that. We also realized there was no actually globally agreed species sort of level plan for prioritizing action. This is something we've worked on a bit for lions and for African wild dogs, to say if you look at all the remaining populations left, which ones are most fragile? Why are they the most fragile? Where should we be prioritizing action? And there is no one answer to this. Some investors will want to work in populations that are very, very threatened and the last few left. Others will want to put their resources into the more secure populations that might have a longer term future. So we wanted to do a range wide sort of review and then a prioritization analysis, and then ideally build on things like they've done with the Tigers Forever model, to build a kind of cheetahs forever model to act on highest priority threats. And then the last one that we focused on was really thinking about the resource needs. I mean, we know that resources are limited for conservation. So how do we actually think about what is available at the moment? How would you allocate the current resources? And then how would you think about novel financing mechanisms, things like biodiversity credits that could have potential for cheetah conservation? And in all of that, we really need to focus on capacity building and leadership programs to make sure that of all the expertise that was in that room, how do you actually make sure that it's properly and effectively shared with everyone that needs to be part of that, so we can build conservation leadership and political will for conservation.
So the declaration, it wasn't just that was the aim. You got the declaration, everybody signed it, and then that's it. Wash it, that job done. I find that it's just a starting point, and it's not exactly a manifesto, but it kind of sets the tone. Then I know that there's also it's kind of a working thing as well. So am I right in saying that there's like working groups? Because we've spoke on the channel about the Species Survival Commission and all the working groups that are on there. Is that a similar type of thing with the declaration? Is that, is it set out, and the working groups, are they working?
Well, I think the working groups, as you say, this is meant to be not just about words, but about action. So these working groups have been formed since the summit to try to make sure that that commitment and those collective relationships you've talked about, where we can learn from each other, are actually turned into something that can be really actionable. And I think they're not that dissimilar to some of the other working groups I've been on with things like IUCN, etc. But again, you see that passion and that interest shine through. So obviously, when people go back to their normal lives, everyone's busy, it can often drop down the radar a bit, but I've seen that commitment really stay for driving forward some of these working groups. And I'm excited to see that in that declaration, we really put that this isn't the end, this is the beginning of something. So this is the steps we want to take. And I think holding ourselves to account and everyone that was there and everyone that signed the declaration, how can we move those forward so that in 3 years we look back and don't just say, oh, we had the declaration and we're just going to have another declaration. What did we do and what didn't we do? And that was another part actually of the of the summit, that we said we've got all these range-wide plans, we've got national action plans, etc. It'd be really fascinating to look back through those action plans and the range-wide plans and say what has been achieved and what hasn't been achieved, and why have the things that haven't been achieved, what has been the stumbling block for those? And so you learn from that rather than just writing it all down and leaving it on a shelf, so that we can really use that as we move forward with these working groups to think about how do we change that into action. Is it only a lack of funds? Is it a lack of time? Is it a lack of engaging with the right people? And I think that's something that these working groups will really be exploring.
I think it's great that it's very difficult sometimes to get so many people to agree on a focus or a direction, but I think it's definitely heading that way. And also, I mean, people that are watching or listening, that maybe, there are some strange people around that cheetahs are not their favorite animal, but there's huge overlap as well. I know that you're heavily involved still with lion projects and stuff like that. So, ultimately, as almost like a byproduct, would you find that the declaration will assist or benefit other species as well?
Absolutely. As you say, the kinds of problems that cheetahs face are not unique to cheetahs. I mean, they are about habitat loss, they're about prey loss, conflict with people, and ultimately they're about having conservation be quite low down the political agenda and the agenda of people like business people or others to invest in it. And because often it conflicts with development. So it's seen as something that's kind of a nice to have, but if you're, of course, choosing between conservation and development, development will win. And some of the things that we've put into the declaration and some of the things we'll be focusing on, like resource mobilization, novel financing mechanisms, are really focused on how do we change this from it being development, despite conservation, to development because of conservation, and making that a really central element of it. So that will have scope and impact way beyond cheetahs. And all of these networks that are built, the relationships, the models, the things that are tried and either succeed or fail, because we learn from failure as much as we do from success, that will all really have impacts for many other species as well.
When you travel around the world, you know, and see conservation in action, and you live and you breathe it. Is there a lot of the time when supporters and donors and stuff, they look at it, the only news really that gets into standard broadcasting is bad news. The bad news sells more than anything else. But do you see a positivity in the conservation world? And is there that hope? Not all projects are going to be successful, but in general, do you feel that there's the positivity and the hope there for the future?
I definitely do. And I really feel that we're seeing quite a sea change in conservation at the moment. When there was lots and lots and lots of space and relatively few human pressures on the environment, people sort of ring fenced off areas for wildlife and left it there. And that was kind of simplistic, often damaging for people, but that's kind of how they felt the conservation just was. Now we're moving into an era which is far, far better when we're thinking about this intertwining between conservation and development. I think we recognize when you think about it that of course nature underpins everything in our lives. We cannot be without the air and the water and the forests and the wildlife that is a vital component of that. So I think rather than just recognizing that intellectually or feeling it as we all do when we're out in nature, it's through work like we'll be doing through the summit and beyond, is all about sort of how do you get that actually really embedded in political processes. How do you get the will for it? And we're seeing much more interest from business people, from politicians to really think about how you can put nature. There's a real nature at the heart of these kinds of things. And there's a real swell in these kind of nature positive solutions. We see this traction and this growing community of people who are interested in conservation because it can be good for development and making human rights and equity and social justice and all these vital things are a really central part of it. And I think that will end up with better conservation and better outcomes for people. And I'm excited to be a conservationist this time because I definitely feel there are some really positive movements in it.
So to close up, if people are watching and they they kind of see and they hear that there's this stuff going on, and they wonder how they can help, what can they do? And I know this is the $1 million question, but what would you suggest that people do that can help in frontline conservation?
I think the biggest thing they can do is, well, twofold. You've got to look at your own life and what you can do within it. And people often just say, well, donate to wherever. It's a difficult time for everyone at the moment. So often people aren't able to donate. It's great if they can. If they can do that, I'd really look for good organizations based on the ground that get a lot of that money down to local people that are really actually locally driven. If you can't give money, then obviously it's about much more about things. And I think this ultimately is more important. It's about sharing the word of these things, talking about conservation, building networks, building awareness, and thinking about the small things that you can do in your life to improve the environment. And that might be everything from, beach litter picks to reducing your meat consumption because of the carbon impacts that has. So all sorts of different things just to make everything a bit better for the environment. And I think that really helps going forward. And also I think if you're keen on contributing to conservation, thinking about what your passion is, because people often say, I'd love to be a conservationist or I'd love to help conservation, but I'm terrible at science. And I always think you don't need to be good at science. If someone comes up and they're a fantastic poet, that's amazing. You can use your poetry or your art or your music or your business skills or whatever it is. Use the things you've got, and there will be an avenue where you can overlap that with conservation. There are lots and lots of different ways of doing it. It is a global problem that we face with wildlife decline, and we need a global community to address it. So everyone needs to take that passion they have, take that interest, believe they can help, and do whatever thing they can using their skills to try to all build a better world for people and for wildlife.
So everybody can be a conservationist, basically. You
Absolutely. We need everyone to be a conservationist.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's the question and I concur exactly what you said. Everybody says, I'd really like to be a conservationist. Well, do it. Do it. Yeah, and like you say, you don't need that doctorate. You don't need necessarily that degree to contribute. And it's and when we mention contributions, people automatically think that's a monetary thing. Not always the case.
Definitely.
And in-kind conservation, if that's such a thing, is
Absolutely.
hugely valuable. Well, Amy, thanks very, very much for joining us today, and your insights into the workings of the Declaration, because we mention it all the time, but to understand the nuts and bolts of it is really valuable to us. Thanks very much for everything you do, and continue doing it. And hopefully, we'll catch up somewhere around the world sometime soon. So, Professor Amy Dickman, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Brian. Cheers.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview, and it gave you some more insights and a better idea of the summit, and also that diversity of conservation, because it is so key now. Conservation through collaboration. It's getting everybody together, working in the same direction, all taking maybe different roles, but all with a common goal. So, for more information about the summit, but also the holistic conservation that Cheetah Conservation Fund is so involved with and have been for the last 34 years, please visit our website at cheetah.org. There you'll find all different resources and see how you can get involved. You can be part of that collaboration to help save the cheetah, its ecosystems, and everything, for a better future. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Cheetah TV.